August 2016, North Korea shocked the world with its first successful submarine launch, ballistic missile, in the Sea of Japan. This demonstrates the accumulation of over 40 years of work by the North Korean country, scientists, and political leaders to bring this moment to the world. It gives them a lot of flexibility in terms of nuclear strikes. They are no longer limited to the Korean Peninsula. They can now maneuver multiple ballistic missiles around the Korean Peninsula, Sea of Japan, and even into the North Pacific. This is the story of how we got here. This is the Sinpo class sub brief. Our story begins in 1963 when the Soviets share the design of the ROMEO submarine with China. This happens after the Sino-Soviet Friendship and Mutual Assistance Treaty is signed in 1950. In 1953, they signed another treaty called the Agreement of the Supply of Naval Equipment and Technical Assistance. This is also known as the June 4th Agreement, and this is the specific agreement where this ROMEO comes into play. So the ROMEO is a diesel boat submarine designed, modeled after the World War II German Type 21 U-boat they had at the end of World War II. Russia took a lot of those submarines, reverse engineered them, and built their own version in Russia, in the Soviet Union, in the early 1950s, late 1940s, and they called them the ROMEO. It was a diesel boat. So they're taking this ROMEO and they're offering it to China. They're saying, hey, make a copy of this and you can have it. And so that's part of this agreement. So in 1961, China is authorized to build the Type 033 variant of the ROMEO. So the Type 33 is the Chinese version of the Russian version of the German World War II U-boat. Soviet Union assists China in military and economic aid throughout the 60s, even though eventually their relationship would sour and that would come to an end around 1965, 67. Up until that time, they were pretty good trade partners and were helping each other out because they shared similar, although quite different specifically, communist beliefs. And it was that difference in Leninism, Marxism, that caused the rift between the two countries eventually. But before that rift, they were sharing a lot of technology, including military technology, with each other. In 1967, the Type 33 ROMEO diesels are 100% indigenous to China. China doesn't need any outside help to build them now. So here's the ROMEO class. It's a 1,800-ton diesel boat submarine. Basically, think of a World War II submarine with a few Cold War 1950s era modifications, and you've got the picture in your mind. It does 15 knots on the surface, 13 knots submerged, because it does not have an albacore round hull that we see on modern submarines. So as long as it has this non-hydrodynamic efficient design, it will always be a little bit faster on the surface like a ship than it will be submerged. It's also running on the battery submerged, so that doesn't have as much power. It has a 9,000 mile range. It has 8 torpedo tubes, 6 forward, 2 aft, and a crew of about 54 people. The Chinese have put up to 70 people on these ROMEOs, so that number is flexible. Don't hang your hat on just 54. It's between 54 and up as many as 70. And again, it's based on that old German design. It is noisy, it is slow, it is vulnerable to attack, but it does one thing very well that all diesel boats do well, and that's coastal defense. And that's how the Chinese are using it. That's how the North Koreans are going to use it initially. And we're going to talk about how that changes in this lecture. So here's a couple photos of one of the remaining ROMEOs that is still operational today. And this is quite a feat. This is a 60-year-old submarine that they still run in 2021. And there you can see the leader of North Korea taking a tour on board, meeting the crew. They take him out into the bay for a little underway, looking through the periscope. A nice day on board a boat for him. So how did North Korea get this? Well, that story begins in 1971 with something called Project 13. China, in order to increase or improve relations with North Korea that were already pretty good, decided to give them free of charge 4 completed ROMEO diesel boats with crews and teach the North Koreans how to sail and maintain these submarines from 1972 to 1975. They get 4 submarines. China called this the 13th Aid Project. North Korea called it Project 13. You may see both are interchangeable. So China will supply submarine kits to North Korea. Those are partially built submarines that will be finished in North Korean shipyards. And what this does is it teaches North Korean shipyard workers, one, how to build the submarine, and it also gives them the tools and the training that they don't have initially in these shipyards to build these. So in 1973, 2 years after Project 13 begins, North Korea begins assembling the Type 33 variant of the Romeo submarine for themselves. And they continue to do this through the 70s and all the way through the 80s. And by the time the 80s are over, they have a fleet of 20 Romeo submarines that are operational. But they still can't manufacture the pumps and the parts that come with them, right? So what they do is they go to Russia in 1990. Russia is, reaching its economic climax, if you will, where it's going to collapse if they don't get some money. So North Korea pays to purchase 40 old decommissioned or will be decommissioned Romeo hulls and have them sent to North Korea just for parts. So if they need to get that bilge pump from whatever bay, they can go down the pier to hull number 22 and grab the bilge pump out of that and put it in the one that's operational to keep it operational. And that's how they basically have a junkyard of 40 Romeo submarines to maintain a fleet of 20. And it worked. So 1992, they're maintaining that fleet of 20 Romeo submarines, trying to keep it going, when the Soviet Union collapses. And this catches a lot of people off guard, including the people that work in the Soviet Union. There are ballistic missile specialists, nuclear physicists living a very comfortable life in the Ukraine and Russia. And whenever their system collapses, they lose their jobs. They lose the ability to make a living and an income. And one of those physicists, Anatoly Rubtsov, begins putting out feelers and trying to recruit strategic weapons specialists from Russia and Ukraine to move to North Korea and work for that regime, building their ballistic missile program, improving their nuclear program with salary promises between $2,000 and $4,000 American dollars a month. That's really good pay. That's a pay raise for a lot of these specialists. But it's kind of suspicious too, because nobody wants to just go to North Korea. It's a very isolated country. They don't have a very good human rights record, so people aren't just jumping on planes and going over there right away. In order to pay for these salaries, because North Korea needs the money to bring these specialists in and pay them $4,000 a month, they begin selling Scud missiles to places like Syria. And in 1 year, they earned over $100 million to pay these specialists through Scud missile sales. And the way this will work is North Korea will put these Scud missiles on a cargo ship, just a regular old ship, and they'll sail it to Iran, where they will offload the missiles, the contraband, the illegally shipped military arms, through an illegal weapons deal. And they'll put on like electronics, TVs, radios, things that are legal, and then continue to Syria as if they were delivering, durable goods to the country instead of weapons. And then what Iran will do for a fee is they will transport the weapons with planes and over the road in trucks to Syria. And the first year that they did this, in the 90s, Syria immediately began conducting long-range Scud missile testing inside their country with an eye towards Israel, saying, hey, look what we have now. We have the ability to strike Israel from Syria with these Scud missiles. And of course, Israel, very upset about that. How did they get this technology? Well, this is how it happened. So Russia's fallen apart in 1992. Nuclear engineers are looking for jobs, and North Korea's got job openings for them. So Antony, who is coordinating these scientists moving, takes 10 of them out of the initial group of 40 about, and sends them to North Korea just to verify that the job is real and that they're not going to be arrested and put into slave camps or whatever. And turns out all 10 verify, yep, we're here. We're working on the ballistic missile program. We're trying to build this new missile for North Korea. And they verify that the employment is real. So now the floodgates are open in August 1992. Everybody that lost their job in the Soviet Union because of the collapse is now looking to continue their income in North Korea. Well, Russia doesn't want the proliferation of Russian technology just flying away around the world, and they begin arresting these people at the airports. On the 8th of August, they arrest 36 nuclear physicists at the Khabarovsk airport as they're trying to get on the plane. In October 1992, Israeli officials who know where these Scud missiles came from visit North Korea, and they offer to give North Korea money if they would simply stop selling these ballistic missiles. And at the same time in October, as that's going on, Russian police are arresting even more physicists that are boarding the planes in Moscow trying to fly to North Korea. So Russia's doing what it can to prevent their technology from just leaving the country amidst its economic collapse, while Israel is visiting North Korea saying, hey, we'll pay you oil, money, whatever you need just to stop arming the countries around Israel. Oh, and North Korea takes their money too. North Korea says, sure, we'll take your shekels. They certainly did. And then they kept on shipping them. So in October 15th, 32 Russian engineers are arrested in Moscow airport, as well as the physicists. So once those arrests start happening publicly, that stops. People stop trying to fly to North Korea all of a sudden. Anyway, but some do make it. So there are now Ukraine and Russian strategic weapon specialists that bring their experience, technology, documents to North Korea. The genie's out of the bottle. There's no putting it back in. And what missile did these people work on? Well, it was the SSN-6, the R-27 submarine launched ballistic missile. So they're going to build a North Korean version of this, and they're going to build a land-based version and a couple different submarine-based versions. And this is really where it begins. North Korea now has the money because it's been selling illegal missiles. They have the scientists and the engineers, and they have the facilities. And so in 1992, they really start hammering or making progress on the ballistic missile program. In 1993, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard commander, Mohsen Razi, finalizes an agreement to purchase $2.7 billion worth of Scud missiles. This is a huge agreement that gives North Korea a ton of money from Iran to fund this ballistic missile project. And they take that money. They've already taken the Israelis' money and oil that came from Israel, or money to buy oil from Israel. And so they're playing both sides of the deal here. While they're violating the agreement with the Israelis, they're also continuing to supply these Scud missiles to nations like Iran. In 1993, North Korea withdraws from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So not only are they not agreeing to the terms that they had set with Israel, they are turning their back on a decades-old agreement of, hey, no more nuclear proliferation. The countries that have the nuclear technology now cannot sell it or give it or in any way transfer that technology to somebody else. Well, North Korea says, we're not agreeing to that deal anymore. We are out. And so now you have one of the nuclear capable countries kind of like going out on its own, freelance, selling its goods around the world. It's already selling its ballistic missile technology. It's not a big stretch to sell a nuclear warhead with that ballistic missile. And these ballistic missiles are nuclear capable. Of course, North Korea denies having sold any missiles whatsoever, even though they've had, they're on record as being caught selling missiles to Syria already. And then they have this huge deal with Iran. They're denying everything. And that's something that's consistent throughout history in both China and North Korea, is that they lie all the time. And if they get caught in the lie, they lie about being caught in the lie, and they just keep lying. And that's what this is. So where is all this going down? So where are these missiles being built? Where are these scientists being housed? Where is it being tested? It's in the South Hamgyong province of North Korea, centered around a city called Sinpo City. So in Sinpo City, that's where these scientists are, and they're building their missiles and they're doing their testing. when in 1994, this is the very next year after they backed out of that agreement, non-proliferation, they agreed to a new framework that would freeze North Korea's nuclear weapons program in exchange for 2 light water nuclear reactors that would be built by South Korean engineers and funded in part by South Korea, Japan, China, and the United States. So they're going to get free money, free nuclear reactors. And North Korea is like, okay, we will stop research on nuclear weapons if you build these plants for us. It's a great deal for North Korea. So Sinpo City is going to house both those nuclear reactors as well. But ballistic missile weapons tests continue. They're launching ballistic missiles into the Sea of Japan, and that is not a violation of this nuclear agreement because the ballistic missiles can carry conventional warheads. They're not just nuclear missiles. They're ballistic missiles that can do many different things, including try to put a satellite into orbit, which they tried to do but failed. So in 1996, the United States sees what this is still going on, the ballistic missile part. They're not in violation of their agreed framework, but it's still a violation of the intent. So the United States begins sanctions or increases sanctions that are already there and stops US-based companies from selling any kind of technology to North Korea, specifically missile technology, but it's a pretty broadly written statement where they just can't sell technology, period, to North Korea. In 1997, Egypt and Iran both received their shipments of Scud missiles, and in 1 year, they pay North Korea $500 million for these missiles. And that will end up being the average, by the way. Year to year, they will make different amounts of money, but it averages out to about $500 million a year, every year in Scud missile exports. And I have some firsthand knowledge on this in that we tracked these cargo ships from North Korea to Iran and then through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, whatever their final destination was. And the way this would work is they would put the Scud missiles on, they would take them to Iran, take the Scud missiles off, put on the electronics, and then continue to their final port of destination as if it's a legitimate shipment of household goods or durable goods or whatever. But we were watching them do this the whole time. We caught them red-handed, but for whatever political reasons, we couldn't physically stop them. There was one example where one of their ships was stopped in, I believe it was the Arabian Sea. But by the time they had stopped the ship to inspect it, they had already gotten the Scud missiles off and had put the electronics on, so it looked like a legitimate shipment. And it was really embarrassing to the United States for having stopped this North Korean ship that wasn't appearing to do anything wrong, and that's just because we didn't stop them in time. Anyway, in 1999, South Korea pays $931 million for construction of these 2 light water nuclear reactors to begin. This is upfront money. They give it to North Korea. They ship some construction people over there, and they begin building these facilities in 1999. In 2000, North Korea demands, specifically to the United States, but really to the United Nations in general, a payment of $500 million annually, and they will halt ballistic missile exports from their country. These are the same ballistic missile exports that they denied ever shipping anywhere just a few years ago. So now they're confirming that they had been doing it, but for $500 million in annual payments, we'll be happy to stop doing it. This is a great deal for North Korea because they get the same amount of money without having to do anything. So it's like free money for them. Of course, that deal is not agreed to. And in 2003, nuclear power plant construction is halted by the South Koreans for perceived violations of the agreed framework from 1994. So they only have a partially built facility now that is not a nuclear reactor at all. The remaining money, they didn't spend all of the $900 million because they didn't finish the facility. Some of that money goes to Sinpo South Shipyard to build the facilities that will build the submarine that we're talking about today. So this is how this all ties in. They have the Romeo design from, the early Cold War that came from Russia, that came from Germany. They have that design. Now they have the money to build facilities, to build improved and maintain improved submarines. Here are some of the pictures of the partially completed facilities that $931 million had started funding. They have a water pump station for the nuclear reactors there on the left. You can see the water purification plant is right there because your reactors run on pure water, so you don't have radioactive contamination with impurities in the water. You can see some of the housing and barracks for the workers right there, partially completed. And this is where it stopped. South Korea was like, hey, if you're still going to be exporting missiles and continuing to work on your nuclear program, as you said you would not do, we're not going to build you your reactors. But North Korea kept the money. And this is what they did with it. They started improving a southern section of an already existing shipyard in Sinpo. This shipyard is called Sinpo South because, as you can see here on the picture, it's on the southern end of Sinpo City. If you look to the north of Sinpo City, you'll see some piers and docks. That was already there. This facility to the south of the city, at the bottom of the photo, is the new facilities. This is where some of the money went. Instead of building the nuclear reactors, which they could not do on their own, they don't have the technology yet, they improved submarine berths with covered assembly buildings and so forth. Because some of the weather in North Korea can be very bad. I mean, the winters there are brutal. They have, mudslides and, flooding. It's just, it can be a mess. So having facilities that are, climate controlled, basically with a roof on top, makes construction much easier for them. So they basically modernize their shipyard with their remaining money. Here's a few photos of the submarine launched ballistic missile test tower. This is a satellite photo looking down from the top on it, but you can see the shadow and the service tower support structure there kind of holding it up. And that's how they would launch missiles before they put them onto the submarine to test their rocket motors and their guidance systems. You see a low resolution picture on the right from a TV broadcast from KCNA, state news agency, of the leader of North Korea touring the facility with the test tower in the background. And you can see what looks like a missile tube there. That's the missile tube that's going to go into the Sinpo class submarines. All right, here's another satellite photo of the Sinpo class sitting next to the pier and the SLBM submersible test barge. So the submersible test barge has one missile tube on it, and it is able to go out into the harbor there and submerge itself safely, anchored to the bottom, and then launch the missile for testing from a submerged position. And that's how they'll initially test it. They test it on the tower on land first. After they get a successful launch there and all the information they need, they bring it to the submersible test barge and they launch the missile there. First they eject it, then they eject it a second time with the rocket motor igniting. And some of those failed, and they just had to keep trying it over and over again throughout the years. And once they get a successful launch, they're going to put the missile on a Sinpo B experimental ballistic missile submarine. This submarine was first seen dockside in 2014. Here's a picture of it in 2017. And you can see where they put a tarp over the top side where they're doing some work. But more importantly, I want you to look at the sail. That's the tall structure in the center of the submarine. You can actually see the top of the missile tube that runs down through the center of the submarine. It has one ballistic missile tube, and this submarine, while it is operational, it is an experimental test platform. And that is why it is Sinpo B or Sinpo Bravo. It's an auxiliary submarine essentially. And it's doing testing for the entire system. The launch tube, the system that commands it, the fire control system, and the missile itself. So here's what it looks like on the side. And it's also known as the Gore class. That is Korean for whale. It is 67 meters long, so it's a little bit shorter than the Romeo. Oh, and I need to clarify this. This is not related to the Romeo. This is completely built indigenous to North Korea. They built this submarine from the ground up to house a single ballistic missile tube to take it out with a fire control system and shoot a ballistic missile for testing. So again, this is an SSB diesel powered submarine with a ballistic missile tube on it just for testing. It displaces about 2,000 tons, so a little bit heavier than a Romeo. It does about 16 knots on the surface, 10 knots submerged, and has about a 50-man crew. The big thing is its payload is a KN-11 ballistic missile that carries one nuclear warhead and delivers it up to about 750 miles away in any direction. And again, it's 100% built by North Korea. This was not given to them by China. Part of the big surprise here is this test platform. It shows that they're capable of building a ballistic missile submarine. You know, it is diesel powered. It's not as fancy as modern ballistic missile submarines, but it gets the job done. It gets the launch tube away from land and hides the missile under the ocean. Here you can see the KN-11 missile test being loaded into the Sinpo B there on the right. And there are some photos of the test barge there on the left, where you can see the missile tube center line and the floats on the port and starboard side. And you can see how it's just partially submerged there on the top. And then once they fully submerge it, that whole tower will be anchored to the bottom, just a few feet below the surface, where it will eject the missile. Again, they eject it without the engine first, literally just thump the thing out with an ejection gas pump. And then after that test is successful, they ignited the rocket motor on it and ejected it that way. Anyway, so multiple tests were done over a couple years. They had a couple failures, and then they had some successes. And this is the timeline of that. So the KN-11 submarine-launched ballistic missile appears in the Sinpo South Shipyard in 2015. This is the year after we saw this new submarine pierside, the Sinpo B. So now we have the submarine, now we have this missile. The test barge ejection test fails in December 2015. The following year, they do another ejection test, and this one is successful in March 2016. So that's the land-based one. They take it back to the test barge, submerge it in the harbor, and that launch in April 2016, the month after the land-based ejection test, is successful. The Sinpo, it is then loaded onto the submarine in July 2016, and the launch there is a failure. The motor doesn't ignite properly, or the ejection pump failed. Something did not go right where the missile didn't even come out of the water. They go back to port, they fix whatever it was that didn't work, and in August of 2016, the auxiliary ballistic missile submarine goes out into the Sea of Japan and conducts a successful test of the KN-11 missile. And that is what got everyone's attention. This is a big day for North Korea, because now they can take a ballistic missile and hide it in the Sea of Japan or anywhere around the Korean Peninsula. 2021, they are building a Sinpo C. This is going to be the submarine that actually operates and launches these missiles. And we have a few great photos of the leader of North Korea touring the Sinpo City shipyard with advisors here. Here's a great drawing from H.I. Sutton showing the Romeo mod before and after its modernization. So you can see how they made great changes to the sail, and that's where these ballistic missile launch tubes are going to go. How the Sinpo B had one launch tube for testing, the Sinpo C, that's going to be the operational platform hiding these missiles around the Sea of Japan and Northern Pacific, has 3 missile tubes. So it can carry 3 of these ballistic missiles in the sail. One of the ways that they made that work and made that fit is they ripped out the aft battery group. So they just have the forward battery well, which means they have about half the battery power that they used to have. And that greatly reduces the amount of underway time that they can maintain. They have to run their diesel engines and keep that battery charged a lot. So one of the new missiles that we saw them test after the KN-11 successful test in 2016, which they did not test again, by the way. Once they had a successful launch, they were done, because they could always point to that and see what we can do. Had they tested it a second time and it failed, then it would give them a 50-50 track record. But once they had a successful test, it was 100% success if they don't do a second one. So they designed a new missile, and this one is beginning to look more and more modern. This is beginning to look like, the American D5 missiles in appearance. and like the modern Beluga missiles for Russia. This is not implying that they use their technologies, but they're at least mimicking what ours look like. This is the KN-26 Pukguksong 3. That is Korean for Polaris. So Polaris 3, submarine launched ballistic missile. This was successfully launched in October 2019 from the Sinpo B. This missile's length is about 8 meters tall, 1.5 meters around, pretty standard for a ballistic missile. The big thing is that this is a solid fuel propellant. So they now have the ability to blend the chemicals for solid fuel propellant and put them into ballistic missiles. That's a big step forward in missile technology. Early missile technology was liquid fuel in the Soviet Union, and eventually they got the technology to make solid fuel, which was easier to maintain and more stable. Now North Korea can do this as well. So this missile is gas pump ejected, and then once it is out of the water, as you see here in the photos in the bottom, the rocket motor ignites, and that is just like the Beluga missiles or Beluga missiles and the Trident missiles. That's the way that they work as well. So they've done a good job mimicking that. They've got, a great gyro system that can sense the deceleration of ejection and fire the rocket motor and keep the missile pointed upright during that. That is very difficult to do. And as of 2019, they're able to do it. This missile has an estimated range of about 1,100 miles, almost 1,200 miles, based on its test trajectory. They basically shot this missile straight up and let it come about straight back down again because they didn't want to shoot it over Japan. Japan got tired of their ballistic missile tests coming over part of Japan, or at least into what they call the Japan Economic Zone, which is the area around Japan. So they shot this one straight up, came back down again. All right, so here's a great drawing from H.I. Sutton of the Sinpo C. Now, the Sinpo C is not completed yet. It's only partially complete. But from what we know, this is what we expect to see with them. The big thing is the 3 missile tubes that are able to shoot the new KN-26 ballistic missile with a range of about 1,200 miles. Is gas generator ejected, like we said. The rest of the submarine is pretty much the same as a Romeo, we think, with the major exception being the battery well. So a diesel boat normally has 2 battery wells. And so while you're running on one, you can charge the other or vice versa, and it just gives you more capacity. Well, in order to make room for these tubes to come down through the sail, they had to rip out whatever was in the way. Well, one of the things that was in the way, besides some crew berthing, was a battery well. So this thing has extremely limited underway submerged operational capability because the hotel load alone is pretty large on the submarine, and they have half the battery of a 1950s Romeo. Now, they can have really good batteries. They certainly don't have energy cells like Japan has. But the point is, once they submerge and they're operating on the battery, they're not going very far, and they're certainly not going fast. So that is a severe tactical limitation of this otherwise strategic weapon. And to be honest with you, it's more of a political tool than anything else. And there is a new missile. They have built the Polaris 4, and this is in testing. It doesn't even have a designation yet. This is the subsequent missile that comes after the KN-26 that was just successfully tested in 2019. They've got this new missile out, and it's a little bit shorter. We saw it for the first time during the October parades of 2020, where they celebrate North Korea's anniversary, basically, where they wheeled this thing out on a truck, like you see there in the picture, and it appeared to be shorter than the Polaris 3. But that could have been because it didn't have all of its stages connected too. So we're not going to worry about how tall the missile is. What we do know is that it fits the tube that the new Sinpo C submarine has. So it could carry up to 20 of these. We don't know much about this new missile. We literally just saw it for the first time a few months ago as of time of this recording. We don't know its capabilities. We just know that its size is similar to the Polaris 3. And so we assume that it has similar capabilities. Brand new missile. So these are the 4 Polaris versions. The Polaris 2 is the only land-based version. You see it there on a mobile transport, the Polaris 2. Polaris 1, 3, and Polaris 4 are all submarine-launched ballistic missiles. They have developed 3 ballistic missile variants in 4 years. This program is moving at an extremely rapid pace. And they're probably getting outside help, but credit must be given to the North Korean engineers that are coming up with this. North Korea is not as a backwards country as many people would like to think it is. They are moving into the nuclear missile age. Well, hell, they're here. They're here now. All right, final thoughts on the Sinpo C program, or just the Sinpo class program. It is really a modern wonder as to how rapidly they went from getting some engineers in the early 1990s to having a submarine-launched ballistic missile program just a decade or two later. They've really moved at a lightning pace. You know, this is the Manhattan Project of North Korea, and it's working for them. So once operational, the Sinpo C will be able to provide the leadership of North Korea's strategic flexibility by concealing 3 nuclear weapons somewhere in the Sea of Japan, probably, but it has the range to go outside that. They could go into the Yellow Sea if they wanted to, or even onto the eastern side of Japan out into the North Pacific. But this is a very limited range submarine. You know, not just underway, not just under the water, but on the surface as well, because of the weight of the missiles, and they didn't change the engines. You know, it has the same amount of fuel as the Romeo would have, we think. Again, this submarine is not complete yet. And so until we see sea trials, a lot of what I'm saying is best guess. We simply don't know because it's not finished, but this is what it appears to be. What is certainly known is that this thing will be operational very soon, and they will certainly stick nuclear weapons on it and put it to sea. And that has a lot of people rightly concerned because of it. So North Korea has a new tool in their nuclear toolbox, and it's called Sinpo. All right, so I want to thank my supporters here on the Patreon side, the department heads,